Morning, afternoon, evening, good night, everyone. That's the end of the episode.
Thank you for tuning into the Truman Show podcast.
What's going on, you guys? We are the Unqualified Film Bros with a podcast. I'm George. You guys know me, gentlemen.
I'm Declan. You probably know me as well.
I'm Ben. I've been here.
That was nice. And I'm Max. I don't
3
have a
weeks.
pun, but there
3
we go.
weeks strong for Max.
Hell yeah.
So we're changing up the format tonight. We're going to start with some rankings, and then we will get into the meat of our discussion. We're talking about the new MCU flick, Eternals. But for this week, we all decided to rank our favorite MCU or our top MCU directors. Who wants to go first? Hearing nothing, I'll go first.
Okay.
So I'm going to count it down like I usually do. Number 3, Matt Shakman, director of WandaVision.
Oh,
I think taking the MCU into a serial form and looking at this sort of long form story that takes place over several hours, not just 2 or 3, was so unique for the superhero genre on this big of a scale. You know, you'd seen superhero TV shows before, but having the MCU go to television was something new. And then for Shakman, obviously with the writing of Jack Schaefer and the acting talents of, you know, Elizabeth Olsen, Paul Bettany, Catherine Hahn, Teyonah Parris, Randall Park, the list goes on and on, to have that strong cast and that strong writing to then execute all the different decades of television as portrayed through WandaVision was just fantastic. So it's a recent entry into the MCU, but top 3 in terms of the execution of the project through direction. Number 2, Ryan Coogler. Name another MCU film that's been nominated for Best Picture besides Black Panther. You cannot. He took a fantastic cast, you know, an all-black cast, which hadn't been done in the superhero genre before, which was so revolutionary and so well executed. Obviously, the late Chadwick Boseman starring in the film. You've got Michael B. Jordan, Letitia Wright, Lupita Nyong'o, Denai Guerrera, you know, all of these great actors starring in the film, and then to introduce the world of Wakanda in such a great way. The visuals of the film and the way they're presented through the cinematography are stunning. And Coogler, I think, brings the film to another level through his direction. And especially because Black Panther released in, you know, early 2018 before Avengers Infinity War. Yeah, it takes place after Captain America Civil War by like a week in the timeline. But Infinity War, a lot of the action happens in Wakanda. So to establish that world with not only the purposes for the franchise of Black Panther, but for the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe to see this is what can happen in Wakanda was fantastic. And number 1, I don't know if you guys are going to say this one for number 1, Joe and Anthony Russo. I feel like, you know, you could say that that's a quantity over quality answer because they've done 4 films in the MCU, but it's quality. You know, Endgame is my top MCU film. Infinity War is a lot of people's favorite Avengers film. Civil War and Captain America: The Winter Soldier are easily the 2 best Captain America films. No disrespect to Joe Johnston. But I mean, to take this world of superheroes, this interconnected universe, and to execute so well the story by Marcus and McFeely and the whole web of what had been done in previous films, not only with the characters in the Captain America films, but then to bring in everyone from the Avengers films with Civil War and then Infinity War and Endgame. Just there aren't a lot of directors that could do with Infinity War and Endgame, especially what the Russo brothers did. And honorable mentions to Taika Waititi and Jon Favreau for me. So now I'm going to throw it over to Ben for his top 3.
I'd say probably number 3 is going to be Jon Favreau. Like with the Jon Favreau. He obviously pretty much started the entire Marvel universe. Him and great acting by Robert Downey Jr. It was a great half to his comeback. He had done a few movies before, but he fully embodied that role. I felt like Jon Favreau really directed him and the story really well. He set up a lot of stuff and laid a bunch of the groundworks for like what they explored later on. I don't think I need to, say too much about it. It's Iron Man. He pretty much started the Marvel universe.
He also did Iron Man 2 for what it's worth.
Yeah. But I mean, Iron Man 2, not as groundbreaking as the first one.
Yeah.
I'd say number 2 is going to be James Gunn. He took a ragtag group of adventurers that seemingly would be kind of hard to like sell to the audience. They're
Now
kind of,
you're talking about the Suicide Squad?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he took his talents and he brought them to DC as well. But like he had that vision to bring all these adventurers together. They're outcasts, in different realms, but brought it together and made it a fun adventure. It didn't feel like you needed, the knowledge of the comics or the knowledge of, they encountered so much stuff just in that first movie. You never felt like overwhelmed. And I think that takes a special like directing talent to like manage how much you put into the movie and how like it flows with the plot. And created a great soundtrack. I thought it was really unique to take that approach and to take such a music heavy approach. It's sort of is like a Baby Driver. Things were somewhat, they weren't like choreographed like Baby Driver, but like the music was a big part of all the scenes, especially like Peter Quill dancing to music. And I thought it was really unique, the whole vision for it. It was funny and it was entertaining. And then number 1, I got to give it to Taika Waititi. I think that was easily one of the most entertaining films. And he brought life to a movie series in the third one, which had pretty much been terrible for the first 2. And I thought he took like, a very unique approach. There was a lot more humor. It was a lot less serious than the last Thor movies. And finding that like lightheartedness. And I feel like that carries over to, him and like Avengers, Endgame, when he's all fat and like playing PlayStation and stuff. It explored a lot more of like that humor side that you can have with Thor. And any of the Asgardian gods, like, the way that Loki and him played off each other. And it was not as like Shakespearean, I guess, is what Kenneth Branagh was going for. But it just didn't meld well with the rest of the Marvel universe, and it wasn't as entertaining and fun. And I feel like that's what you're going for with a Marvel film.
Yeah.
So yeah. I guess I'll give it over to Max.
All right, I'll count it down to number 3. I'm gonna go with the Russo brothers. Infinity War is my favorite Avengers film. the tone shift is incredible, but I think it's done in a way that adds more than if it had sort of continued in the same vein of some of the lighter-hearted Marvel movies. And my goodness, I can still hear the silence in the theater after the snap. Yeah, I mean that's tangible right there, and that's the power of making films, and something that I think the Russo brothers pulled off brilliantly. Number two, I'm gonna go with Taika Waititi. He, like Ben said, brought a lot of levity to Thor, which was missing, re-injected a bunch of life into the character, and now Thor is currently the only of the original six with the fourth movie. So, that says something. Who knows how many more we'll get with Chris Hemsworth, or how many even with Thor as a character in general. But you know what? It felt like new life, and that's important. And keeping with new life, my number one is John Watts, who did Spider-Man. And it might be because of the sour taste that the last installments of both the Raimiverse and the Mark Webb version of Spider-Man left with me. But, I think getting a young kid in Tom Holland who actually looks like he's in high school and can play a kid that is in high school, again, gives a new take to a character. And the film, whatever you might think of Spider-Man Homecoming, or any of them really, it just was refreshing to see how a young kid who is supposed to make mistakes can still fit into the world of the Avengers and still make a difference. And now he's moving forward, quite frankly, as one of the leaders of the Avengers and of this new generation of superheroes. He's one of the veterans on the team now. So, if Tom Holland Spider-Man and John Watts are able to carry that over into No Way Home, then I will say it's a great trilogy. Well done.
Not to mention John Watts is going to be at the helm for Fantastic Four in the MCU.
Yes, he is.
So
Yeah.
excited to see what he can do with that after his trilogy of Spider-Man films.
Mm-hmm. All right, Declan, bring us home, buddy.
I'm genuinely mad at. I have no one to blame but myself for this, but my list is unironically number 3, Jon Favreau. As Ben said, the MCU would not exist without him. Iron Man 2 was like kind of a mulligan, but he also literally made an entire film explaining why Iron Man 2 was a mulligan, so I almost got to give him a pass for it. But I also feel that Iron Man 1 is it's sheer uniqueness. Its quality right at the start is why we are still talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe today, and that's truly something special. So, number 3, Jon Favreau. Number 2 is Taika Waititi. And again, his personal influence. I'm so sorry. His personal influence on the franchise that he came in the third installment is like so brilliant and so good that he kind of single-handedly transformed the entire character of Thor. That's like something no one else has done. That's like almost impossible. Like, we now think of Thor as a funny character, when before he wasn't that. I mean, he had comedy as much as the next guy, but like thanks to Waititi, just who brought so much life and energy and so much to the screen, transformed Thor over the course of a single film, probably for the better, and is truly a remarkable feat of directing. Why he's my number 2. And My number one is James Gunn. So meaning Ben and I had the exact same list, except we switched around 1 and 2. Again, no one's fault but my own. James Gunn, I feel he has somewhat the advantage of getting to write the films as well as direct them, but nonetheless, he imbues a great personal energy and personal stuff into it and makes these really compelling characters. You know, he starts off with Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and just like defines, you know, redefines pre-existing characters completely and changed how everyone sees them. And then he comes in with Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and makes a sequel that's even better than the original. And also, fun fact, all of my opinions are correct and everyone else's is wrong. That's a fact. You can look that up. That's a joke. We disagree on volume two. Well, no,
I'd like to point out that the three of us who aren't talking right now are unanimous in our perception of which Guardians film is better. But go off, Declan.
But still, nonetheless, my opinions are correct. You know, it's amazing. This is how it goes. No, but I think no matter where you feel they land, I think we can agree on the quality itself of both films in general. And so that's why I think for being able to have such a unique thing about him, that's why I would say James Gunn is my number one Marvel director.
Yeah, I got to say, of all the rankings we've done so far, you know, Martin Scorsese, Adam McKay, even the sci-fi and fantasy last week, this was the hardest ranking we've had, at least for me, just because of the sheer directing talent that the MCU has had over the last 13 years. And speaking of directing talent in the MCU, obviously Oscar-winning director Chloe Zhao just released her first foray into superhero movies with Eternals. You guys previewed it last week. What'd you think? This was I was texting Declan I guess about 24 hours ago. It was a unicorn in the MCU.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty distinct, or it almost feels distinct lore wise. Like there's a lot to this one. Like literally has a title crawl, which I was like, you know, when that appeared
in the beginning.
Oh my god! I wasn't even like looking that hard at the screen, you know. And so then it's like, wait, oh shit, wait, I gotta pay attention to this fight, you know.
Time to do some reading.
The scale of this project was massive, right? It was something like 7,000 years, moving from Babylon to Mesopotamia into, you know, the 21st century. That's insane. That's a lot of time to cover. And I think I know some of the criticisms directed towards the movie have to do with pacing and storyline, but the scope of the movie was huge. And, you know, it deals with scope and scale in other ways too, with the size of the Celestials, right? Arishem is massive, and they can, you know, I don't know, change their size or whatever, some weird stuff like that. But this is a huge film that I think overall did a really interesting and intricate job of delving into Eternals lore, Celestials lore, and just cosmic beings in general, which I think it set up what is continuing to come out of the MCU in a really nice way. And those are my most positive thoughts of the movie. We could get into critiques later, but overall, I think it was a really solid entry into the MCU.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get into criticism later. You mentioned the pacing. the use of, well, I'll get into that later. In terms of positive feedback to this film, having seen it twice now, the pacing doesn't feel as much of an issue on a second viewing. Like, it didn't feel like 2 hours 37 minutes in the theater on the second viewing. Maybe that was just, having some level of familiarity with the story or what have you. But I think the way that it was executed, it's gotten some flack, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But pacing, I mean, maybe I'll see it a third time, but actually I'm sure I'll see it a third time at some point. But pacing wasn't that big of an issue for me, at least on the second viewing. Other positives, being on location. Everything in the Marvel Cinematic Universe these days is done in a studio with a roof, with a green screen. You saw it with Avengers Endgame. You saw it with Spider-Man Far From Home. We're going to see it moving forward, I'm sure. But for Chloe Zhao to say, you know what, we're going to be in the streets of London. We're going to go to these, small remote islands for this climax. It really elevated the weight and the realness of this world that they were building in this film. And so having the actors not be like, oh, we're in London, but actually we're on a back lot in Georgia. It was like that made the experience. I was able to connect more with the experience just from having seen them on an actual location on set. And then just in terms of more positives, the cast. There are 10 Eternals plus Dane Whitman and Arishem and Phastus's family, and you've got all these characters that we've never seen before that are being introduced. And they don't exactly, I mean, the runtime is over 2.5 hours. They don't have time to get to know every detail about every character. And of course, spoiler alert, some of them are killed off. But there are great performances in this film. Brian Tyree Henry as Phastus was a huge bright spot. Kumail Nanjiani as Kingo, my favorite part of the film. Of course, I'm a big Silicon Valley fan, so seeing him in that role changed it up. The Bollywood dancing was very funny, and his relationship with his valet Karun was hilarious. Richard Madden folded perfectly into the scope of the MCU. I feel like he became Icarus. I really enjoyed his performance. Angelina Jolie, could have seen more of her. She was great. Kit Harington, again, that post-credit scene, which we'll get into in a minute. A lot to think about, but I'm excited to see more of him in his role as Dane Whitman. So yeah, definitely the cast and being on location were my brightest spots.
Yeah.
Ben, what'd you think?
I'm a bit conflicted on it. I've been a big fan of the comics and the Eternals, the Celestials, and I'm a big fan of just cosmic stuff. I love Silver Surfer, Fantastic Four, Guardians of the Galaxy. That's my my favorite types of comics, other than Doctor Strange. And so the exposition was a lot of fun for me because I read the comics and because I want to explore the world more. But at the same time, I can understand someone who is not interested in that. It doesn't fit the mold of a Marvel movie where you can just come and watch, and yeah, there's ties to the other movies, but you can be entertained. It's a little bit overwhelming to connect all the dots. And this film is very detail heavy. And so you're dealing with a lot of these cosmic threats, and it's hard to tether you if you're just a regular audience member and not into the comics really, you have like Dane Whitman, who sort of functions as like the human, asking the questions that we want to know, and sort of being present, just observing like the Eternals and finding out about them. But at the same time, a lot of the plot revolves around like, the Earth exploding basically, because Titans come out and there's a Titan who's judging them, who's made these robots who they've sent to Earth. And, I watch a lot of sci-fi. I love detailed stuff. But at the same time, it's tough to say, it was a great film just because of that, because I like the details. Because there are a lot of issues with it. But overall, like, I would say I liked it. But yeah, I have some issues with the film overall. I will say, seeing the Celestials, like the sheer scope of them, was very cool. I loved all of, how it looked with, like you said, on location, but also just how they managed to fit the Celestials in, and how the Eternals like talk with them and things. You get that grand scope of like, okay, these are the guys who literally made the universe.
Yeah, what you were? No, go ahead.
If we're going into more, negative stuff, because that is sort of the negative for the movie, is it's dealing with a scope so large that it can be very hard for the audience to care even about the Eternals, because there's a bit of like a nihilistic approach going on. There's so much, and they even say it like, billions dies so that, billions can live or whatever. A planet dies so that they can populate the rest of the universe. That it's hard to really root for anyone. Marvel movies have always been based on, there's some sympathetic villains, right? But there's not like a clear good versus evil here. It's very hard for an audience to like wrap their heads first around that scope, and then second on who to root for. One of the Eternals, spoiler, sort of goes rogue and stuff. None of them are really right. You feel biased, I guess, because you're human and you want the Earth to live, but at the same time, I feel like it's hard, unless you're really into the Marvel Universe, like I've said, to really care about the Earth in this movie, because it's so meaningless in the grand scope that they create in this movie.
Like I'll just say, like, I kind of feel like I have like two major issues with the film. One is only personal and not actually something I can really criticize the movie for. The other is like I would feel the actual criticism. I'll start with the actual criticism, which is I feel the ending is somewhat of like they just couldn't quite square the circle, kind of, because of exactly what you're saying. They kind of make it out like it isn't I mean, it's bad that the Earth is destroyed, but the Celestial itself is sort of important for like life, and like it's kind of like, wait, this doesn't feel fantastic that it's
they literally kill like basically a newborn child of a Celestial at the end of the movie.
And they set up the idea of not like actually killing it, but then later kill it, and it's really it just feels really weird. And also like character motivation surrounding it just again feel odd. Like the one that stood out to me, it was Sprite, where it's like, okay, Sprite goes with Icarus because she loves Icarus. Like I feel like that makes sense. But then after the conflict, it's like, Sprite, I'll make you human so that you can grow up and feel all the things you want to feel. And it's like, oh, good. And like Sprite's forgiven, and it's like, I mean, you're kind of really opposed to one another just there. Now you're
considering Sprite literally stabbed Cersei in the back.
Like literally stabbed her, like not like we literally see her do it. It was kind of, I get it, the 7,000 years, but still, like that doesn't mean anything,
Yeah, It really seemed like the Eternals turned on each other very quickly, and I suppose you could say the Celestials are, they're gods, and their will is their will. That's holier than anything. But at the same time, for the audience member, like, you can draw a lot of the stuff out of this movie, and as a Marvel fan, I did. I just feel like the barrier to entry for this film is much, much higher. And at the same time, even for like fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's not even kind to them, really. There's very little to tether it even to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They mentioned Thanos a few times. Thanos comes up, they show Harry Styles at the end, but at the same time, it's just like there to, it's a Deus Ex Machina. It's like, well, why weren't you there to, stop Thanos or anything? And it's like, oh, we've just been here, we've just been hanging out. And so, yeah, they talk about the Avengers a little bit, but there's no like run-ins with anything familiar. There's nothing familiar to the rest of the cinematic universe. So
yeah, with that, introducing this team of superheroes that don't really have much of a connection to the greater MCU at this point, you come back to the Guardians of the Galaxy. 7 years ago, the film came out. They were a lesser known superhero team for not diehard Marvel fans, but like your mainstream, I'll go see a Marvel movie. I know the general story of it. Of course, I was I was a comic fan at that point. I hadn't seen any MCU films at that point. But Guardians of the Galaxy, they were this cosmic group, not as, powerful, I guess you could say, as the Eternals, but they're still this group that we hadn't really seen before. And there was nothing in the movie beyond the Collector, really, and I guess Thanos a little bit, to tie it into the greater MCU. So Eternals, you've got mentions of Thanos. You've got, are you a wizard like Doctor Strange?
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean,
other than that, nowhere is a severed head of a Celestial, and that's all you've ever been given about any of that.
You feel like you're just hearing things, and the strange thing is that there's as much connection to the MCU as there is to the DC universe, because they mentioned Superman
and Batman.
and Batman. So it's like this. It feels so isolated, and they're trying to set up the scope of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so then even the exposition, I'm like, I'm very biased. I like this stuff, but I can't quite agree with the way that it was presented, because it feels very much different. I mean, it's different in its tones, very much more adult. There's for a sex scene and whatever, but I feel like the main problem is just like it feels so isolated. The scope is so big, and you don't care about any of them because you have no tether. It's too big of a scope for.
I mean, one thing about something that George just said about Guardians is that they were a bunch of misfits. If anybody can relate to being a misfit, historically, it's comic book fans and superhero fans, especially Marvel. Even at that stage, it was kind of mainstream, but it wasn't what it is now, right? They've grown and exploded in popularity, and the stories they're trying to tell are much larger than what Guardians was. And in terms of connecting it to the DC universe, it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier, but Wonder Woman and how she became disillusioned with humanity in between Wonder Woman 1 and I think it was 1984 or something like that, where she lost faith in humanity, right? And that's part of what I think happened over the course of these 7,000 years. You live for 7,000 years, your life, you watch the people you love, you care about die, and you're not surrounded by people that have that same lived experience. You watch people hurt one another. You watch them be evil and do bad things to one another, and you've been instructed not to do it because that's what you believe your purpose to be. And I think one of the more interesting parts about this movie is that we can't understand that. And, you know, to Ben's point, that can be kind of isolating for some fans. Like, we can't fathom what it would be like to be instructed by this cosmic being saying, you know what, don't do anything. Someone's gonna rob someone up. Don't do anything. Just sit there and wait until these other bad guys come, and then you can deal with these bad guys, but not that bad guy.
Well, to that
And
point,
that's go ahead.
one thing we haven't talked about really tonight is the deviants. Like, it ended up being, you know, Icarus and Sprite and Arishem were the villain. I hate doing this, but they were the antagonists of the climax of the film. And, you know, you get the deviants, you know, one of them is evolving and becoming more like the Eternals. The other ones are sort of these no-name CGI monsters that have become the norm in the MCU. You know, the Chitauri and the Outriders and everything we've seen in the Avengers movies. But, you know, Ultron sentries. And, you know, you've got, you know, Ben, you mentioned it briefly on last week's episode. You've got the deviants, and, you know, you're going to have this battle between the Eternals and the deviants. I mean, there's the skirmish that they have in the forest. There's, you know, the quick hit in London at the beginning of the film. Then there's Thena taking out the leader, you know, isolated in a cave at the end of the film. The deviants, you know, they hype him up in the trailer like, we were instructed not to interfere unless deviants were involved. Yeah, well, the deviants aren't really involved in the climax of the film. They're there, they're part of the movie, but it's Eternals versus Arishem.
But I think
another example of what I was talking about, of like the ending not being able to square itself. It's like the deviants are set up and then just abandoned as a plot line. I feel like
it focused too much on humanizing like the deviants and everyone, that like the deviants just sort of come in there and like, oh yeah, we were, you know, made by the Celestials and sort of betrayed too, and, you know, lied to and whatever, or prevented from evolving. But you know, they're sort of just in there and then they're out of there, but they don't play a major role. And even like the main guy just dies. I mean, it was the most anticlimactic thing ever.
But isn't the ending though kind of the most human thing possible, where the Eternals turn on themselves? And isn't that what they've been watching for 7,000 years? Humanity turn on one another, and now they're doing it, even though they're not human. They're not, I mean, they're kind of Eternals, but they're not really. They're more of this like weird amalgam.
Or a first try at the Eternals.
Yeah,
I think
first try
Arishem
at the
says that
Eternals.
he was there. They were their first.
And there's this whole talk of, you know, we're not going to evolve. We're not going to, you know, we're not allowed to change. But they did. They all did in their own ways. And you got to see that in the ways that they separated and moved on with their lives after they separated, after I think it was Babylon, or maybe, I don't remember, Mesopotamia.
Tenochtitlan, wasn't it?
Yeah, that one. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I think that for me was fascinating to see that talk of evolution, and how at the end we realized they can't actually evolve in the way that you might think, but they evolved in sort of different way. I don't know exactly how to put it, but I think that they did evolve.
I feel like they sort of evolved. They were sent there to protect the Earth
from
deviants. So, yeah, they didn't.
They were sent there to protect the population.
Yeah, so I feel like they sort of stayed stagnant. You know, like, yeah, they went against their celestial gods, but at the same time, that was their character. Like, they were always good to humans, all of them, and they were instructed not to interfere, but like all of them cared for humans. So I feel like the only one that didn't change was Icarus, and then he changed at the end, and they just flew into the sun.
Well, one of them who didn't really change and was sort of in the middle ground, you could say, was Kingo, Kumail Nanjiani's character.
Yeah.
He was, he was one of the first ones that Cersei and Icarus and Sprite approached to be like, hey, we're getting the band back together. We're going to go fight the Deviants, before they obviously knew of the greater plot. But then he was like, Icarus, you obviously don't approve of this plan to go after the newborn celestial Tiamat, so I'm going to follow you. And then he just dips. And he's not in the third act of the movie until you see Cersei and Kingo and Sprite in London again, with Dane. So Kingo, I mean, he's one of the more powerful Eternals, you could say. I mean, Gilgamesh, who we haven't mentioned yet, is up there with Icarus as, I mean, Gilgamesh, where it's, you don't know which side is in the right, because they all believe, I mean, most villains believe they're in the right in some way, shape, or form, but these are all people we've led, or Eternals that we've been led to believe are heroes, and yet they've got these opposite ideas of, we should let Tiamat be born, we should stop Tiamat from being born. And then there's Kingo, who's just caught in the middle and decides not to fight, even though he's one of the best fighters on the team.
I think, I used good versus evil. I think that the bigger issue I have with the movie, and generally, like, I'm criticizing the movie, but I generally like the movie. I'm
Agreed.
criticizing more because I feel like it will not entertain other people unless you're really into the source material, unless you invest time into it. And like the good versus evil thing, they're all sort of not evil. They're all trying to do the right thing. Celestials procreate and create, new galaxies and stuff. But I feel like, the main bad guy is like the Deviants are the side bad guy. It's sort of to help the evolution, like Max said, of the Eternals, like conscious. But I mean, the main bad guy is the Celestials. Like, that's the thing they're trying to defeat or prevent from being born. And it's tough because of the scale. It's like, there's good versus evil. Like WandaVision, that was sort of like a gray area. It's like, she's taking over all these people, but we can empathize with her because she's grief-stricken and stuff. With the Celestials, it's like over billions of years, and all of this stuff happens, and billions of people. And also, without that tether to like the Marvel universe, it's tough to really care. At least I felt like I never felt like, oh, anyone's in danger. I never cared about anyone in the film. And there's even Dane Whitman, who's like he's the human tether, he's the person we're supposed to empathize with, the human.
He's our eyes into the film.
Yeah. He's only there for the first and last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that post-credit scene gives us.
Yes. Obviously the post-credit.
We're gonna see
he's
more
there
of
sort
him.
of as a teaser, but he does function as humanity because he's beloved of Cersei.
Did anyone pick up on? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just suddenly remembered.
It was just like he was sort of.
Set it up. Oh, wait, can I?
Yeah.
Except recording on Zoom, everyone.
I remember setting it up. I feel like I should just quickly say what my second problem was, just for all the people who are like, "What the? Why would you not say?" I just so I don't forget. My second problem one is deeply personal, which is that I'm so tired of seeing goddamn evil Superman characters in stuff. If it's done well, it's okay. But the fact that the film went out of its way in a movie studio dick measuring contest to compare Icarus to Superman and then make him evil, I'm like, okay, guys, stop it. It's been done many times before. Stop doing evil Superman. Like, as a fan of Superman, I feel like it just annoys me how everyone is like, oh, what if we have Superman but evil in in this one.
Yeah.
However, that's not the fault of the movie. That's purely my thing, which is why it's, even though it's a problem I had, it's not really the film.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
he's not Superman,
Yeah,
Declan.
They
He
made
doesn't
that
wear a
very
cape.
clear.
Yeah.
No, I'm pretty sure
Um,
Icarus and Sentry were both ripoffs from Marvel of Superman. So
Oh yeah.
Did anyone pick up on the mirroring, I guess you could say, of Avengers Endgame in this film? It's something I noticed. It's pretty blatant. I mean, it's something that really I just came up with, before we started recording, is that in Avengers Endgame, you get fan service and you're going back to 2012 New York, 2013 Asgard, 2014 Morag. In Eternals, you're going back to these different times in their lives, in their experience on Earth that shaped who they became in the 21st century. But we don't have any connection to it. So when
Yeah.
you're going back for 10, 15 minutes to say, oh, this is what happened in Mesopotamia when they first arrived. This is what happened in 1945 when Phastos was like, my technology is helping them advance too far. We haven't seen that before. So exposition for the sake of exposition helps tell the story to an extent, in my opinion. But then, I mean, we had 5 or 6 flashbacks that, set up the next part of the story, or even like looking back at what Icarus did to Ajax when he pushed her off a cliff and fed her to deviants.
Yeah.
But you're giving all of these flashbacks, all this exposition, and it's just it plays into what people have said about, and what I've said wasn't that big an issue on the second viewing, but it plays into the pacing concerns of the film, because there are these drags where it's just, all right, we're not in the action of the story of the film, we're looking at backstory.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So before we wrap up here, I actually wrote a note here on my cell phone about the interactions I'd most want to see between Eternals characters and pre-existing characters in the MCU that I thought you guys would enjoy. And I have one for each of the Eternals that we saw in the film, even the ones that have unfortunately passed on.
Yeah.
So here we go with my list. Ajax and John Walker. I think super soldier who's kind of all about himself, and Ajax who's been around for millions of years would be a fun dynamic. Teenage Groot and Sprite. I just think they'd go on adventures together. Maybe that's a Disney Plus series. Mantis and Makari. Just not even for the alliteration, but because their superpowers, I think, would be really fun to watch together. Thor and Gilgamesh, just getting drunk at a bar, arm wrestling.
Well, I have a beer.
What's
I
up?
counter with Thena
Well, I have
and
a beer.
Thor.
Thena and Thor. Well, Thena, I put up against Quill, and just she's this majestic warrior, and Quill's like, I'm gonna improvise my way through every fight. Doctor Strange and Cersei, just not even because of what Dane Whitman says in the film, but because I think, again, seeing them play off of each other beyond their powers, but as heroes in the MCU, and maybe we'll get to see that. Hank Pym and Phastos, 2 tech guys.
That'll probably happen, honestly.
One that I actually didn't come up with, I saw this one just scrolling through Twitter. Icarus and Carol Danvers, because they are the most overpowered beings in the MCU to this point. Rhodey and Kingo, because Rhodey is very modest and Kingo is very immodest. So I think their conversation would be a lot of, what we saw from Kingo and then what we've seen from Rhodey, just in terms of the scale, their level of ego and heroism. And then finally, just because of how much they like to get in each other's, or how much they like to get in people's heads, in one case literally, Bucky Barnes and Druig. I think Druig, knowing Bucky's history of having people in his head, would make for a very interesting interaction. And then, of course, Luis from Ant-Man with any of them.
I'm gonna add one, George, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Karun and Happy.
Oh my God. I like it. You guys have any others? Ben, Declan?
Think it would be great to have Druig and Wanda, because then just whole lot of insane stuff would happen, and possibly the universe would get destroyed of two people with sort of mind control powers, like interacting with one another.
Yeah. How about Hawkeye and Arishem?
Yeah, what a team up.
That's a Disney Plus show for you.
Yeah.
Final
Can I-
thoughts
can
on
I-
Eternals?
Can I bring one quick thing up? I'm genuinely question for anyone else. Did the place where Druig was in the Amazon, right? He was in the Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did anyone else sort of feel like he was low key running a cult there or something like that? I almost feel like
It was a cult. Yeah, what do you mean? It was a cult.
Okay, good. It was
legitimately like it was the same families that lived with him, and he just like kept them there.
good.
Yeah.
Good. I just wanted to like make sure I wasn't great. Okay, good. We all agree. It's a
He
cult.
couldn't
Yeah.
control all of humanity at large, so he controlled one small village in Central America.
It's kind of messed up, but yeah. Okay.
Any more final thoughts on Eternals? I think
Nope.
the general consensus is there are flaws that are noticeable in the film, but we all, the sense I got from our
I liked it.
conversations, I liked it. We liked it.
If you're a fan of that, big exposition, world building sort of stuff, especially on the cosmic scale, you'll like it. If you don't, probably won't like it. That's my take.
It was good that they tried something, even if it wasn't a complete success.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna crack anyone's top 10 and MCU projects, but it's far from the bottom of my list.
Solid mid tier.
Max, anything else?
No, you guys said it.
All right. Well, we are gonna wrap up here. We have a very special idea planned for next week. It's gonna be an episode that we haven't done something in that style before, but I think you guys are gonna really enjoy it. I know I've been looking forward to it since we thought of it a few weeks ago. But yeah, we're the Unqualified Film Bros with a podcast, and we will see you for a very special episode next week.
All right.
Good
See ya.
night.
Enjoy the weekend. Happy Veterans Day. Ben's gone. Watching the Ravens game. Dolphins.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.